Hello and good morning. This is Jeff Nasanov of the Space Madness podcast. Today with me is Justin Kugler from Intuitive Machines. Um, Space Madness podcast. This will be the third time I've introduced it, and I think the introduction will be slightly different as always. Space is a maddening career, a maddeningly difficult thing to explore, and basically every obstacle humans can come up with gets added on top of the physical ones that are already there. So that's how I came up with the Space Madness name. Um, that means different things to different people, but hope to get that out of people on this show. I should say that Justin and I met in a couple of interesting ways. Before we even get into the space stuff, we met probably 10 years ago now on a Facebook group that, frankly, has been incredibly meaningful to me, called Dads Married to Doctors. Both of our wives are in medicine. And I'm sure we could talk endlessly about that. In fact, that's what the Facebook group is for. But that's how we first met and realized we shared the NASA career. We had that in common. We first met in person about 5 years ago now, maybe even 6 years ago now, in 2019, at an interesting event on Capitol Hill called NASA Tech Day on the Hill. Actually, that's what this blurry poster is from, now that I think about it. Um, and it was a chance for NASA contractors, uh, research in my case, I believe Redwire in your case, um, to present to Congress critters and the NASA administrator, the then NASA administrator, and I had the interesting experience presenting my NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts research project. It was a lunar cave exploration project, and the administrator happened to walk by, so I cornered him and I told him about it, and he said, "Hey, this should be a program of record." Which for non-NASA people, that basically is the goal, to make your project program of record. So I said, okay, well, I accept cash checks and gold bullion. And he kind of gave me a funny look and walked away. So clearly that didn't happen, but hey, that was a noteworthy experience nonetheless. So that's my introduction. Justin, take it away. I'd love to have you introduce yourself however you want.
Sure. So I'm Justin Kugler, Senior Director of Business Development for Intuitive Machines. Depending on how you count it, I've been in the industry for just about 25 years now. I was a NASA intern in high school and undergrad, and then I spent some time in the Missile and Space Group in the intelligence community. But I came back, to NASA and space exploration because, that's really my passion. It's always been my passion. And really over the past, 15 years, I've really been focused on strategy, business development, the intersection of technology and policy, and not just from a pure profit making motive, but really looking at how do we drive development in space to generate value for people back here on Earth, and how do we add to our industrial economy beyond just
Mm.
transmitting ones and zeros. And that's really been what's motivated me over the past 10 to 15 years.
Well, thank you for that. I really love the way you introduced that, because it brings us to one of the most interesting things going on now, is this opportunity for more and more of industry of smaller and smaller scales to meaningfully contribute both to national defense but also science and exploration. And uh, if you if you go back to a an earlier kind of global paradigm when there were basically two superpowers and only at the national level could you do anything in space, um, it's a really interesting thing to see the changes in commercial and industrial capability, particularly miniaturization of computer equipment and the cost reduction that goes along with it. And that gets us to this point where you can launch a satellite with a cell phone processor in it, that actually does something useful, like looking down at forest fires or something else like that. Um, I also like to explore there's a sort of misconception that all the space industry is just wasting money throwing it into space. Um, Certain billionaire funded rocket launch events contribute to that, although I think there's, to that perception, I think there's also a value to, for space people like us, for anyone to look up at the sky for any reason. I think that's a different subject. But Um, Certainly, I'd like to help the public understand that all of this stuff creates businesses on Earth, paychecks on Earth, supports families on Earth. I mean, there's really nowhere else to spend the money anyway for now. So, thank you for that introduction. I'm curious, how did you get, well, how did you get the NASA internship as a high school student? You know, what led you there? I mean, and when did you know that this was it? This is what you had to do?
Literally as long as I can remember.
Hmm.
I've always wanted to, work in the space industry. When I was, 3, I think is when I decided I wanted to be an astronaut. And then when I was in first grade, I was like, okay, well, somebody has to actually, design and build all that stuff. What's that called? What do they do? And I was like, okay, that's an aerospace engineer. I'm going to be an aerospace engineer.
Hmm.
7 years old, decided that. And everything since then has been driving in that direction. And I was fortunate growing up in the Houston area.
Hmm.
Our neighbor across the street, his son worked for Silicon Graphics on the contract that they had to support the shuttle training facilities at Johnson Space Center.
Wow.
And he was actually trying, to bring me on as an intern for SGI, but they wouldn't take me because they said I was too young. And but he learned that at the time NASA had a program called the Summer High School Apprenticeship Research Program that was,
Hmm.
deliberately designed for NASA centers to create opportunities for, promising, high school age students
Hmm.
to actually like start that STEM,
Hmm.
pipeline, even earlier than with college age students. And I was fortunate enough to interview and get selected. And
Hmm.
I did a good enough job, my first summer that they invited me back for 2 more tours. So I, ended up, doing, 3 tours at Johnson Space Center. The
Hmm.
first was between my junior and senior year of high school, and then my first 2 years of college.
And you went to, I'm not going to guess which Texas college. I don't want to get in trouble here, but it's one of A&M, was it?
Yes, yeah,
Okay, great,
I
great.
went to Texas A&M for undergrad.
Okay. I don't know why I knew that, but I knew if I guessed the wrong one, I'd be in trouble. Um,
Yeah, I've worked for a lot of Longhorns.
okay,
Water under the bridge.
fair enough. So I just love that what great luck that you grew up there and it was across the street, and it sounds like you heard about it almost casually, that you couldn't have gone looking for that opportunity. Certainly in the 90s, there was no
Yeah.
probably wasn't posted any. So I love that. And I hope that kind of happenstance isn't totally gone in the modern world. I suspect it's harder, but I love that story. Um, Now you mentioned the missile side of things. How did you go from the astronaut program, or rather the shuttle program office to that side of the world?
Yeah, so I was graduating from college at the end of 2002. I was a little off sequence, in part because of the some of the previous things that I had done. I was able to I was finishing earlier, but I wasn't on the normal cycle. And at that time, there really wasn't a lot of hiring going on in the
Hmm.
civil space side. And because I was an intern and not a co-op, I didn't have
Hmm.
a guaranteed slot, waiting for
Ah.
me at NASA. But as you may remember, the national security enterprise was exceptionally busy at that time. And, I went to a Texas A&M career fair, trying to find, either a summer job or,
Hmm.
whatever might come my way. And one of my buddies came up to me and was like, "Hey, the CIA is here." And at first I blew it off. I was like, "Yeah, like I've talked to that guy before. He's from Austin and he worked at ops. He doesn't know what engineers do." And he's like, my buddy's like, "No, no, 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 no. She's an engineer and
Hmm.
she knows what we do." He's like, "I don't know, like I think you should go talk to her. I think you might be interested." So I walked up to her and got to chatting, and she looked at my resume and she was like, "Oh." Okay, you're an aerospace engineer. I am
Mm,
too. That's what I do. And she's like, oh, you're a Goldwater scholar. You're an engineer who knows how to write, and you've been a civil servant as an intern, so you've got
mm,
a inkling of how government works. And she's like, I don't know if we'd be able to get your clearance fast enough to bring you in, as an intern over the summer.
yeah,
But
yeah.
this says you graduate in December. I was like, yeah, this was like March. She's like,
Mm.
do you want a job?
Oh, that's great.
And I was
Yeah.
like, wait, what? And so like, literally, that, kind of, the 9 months of, 2002,
Mm,
I did a phone call interview,
mm,
and, they were just like, hey, do you want to take your chances, building widgets for the big primes, or do you want to get your clearance and come learn how to do systems engineering with us?
sure.
I was like, sign me
Well,
up.
that's fantastic.
Where do I go?
Yeah.
And so I had a job waiting for me. I had my clearances processed. I literally, graduated middle of December
Mm,
2002, Christmas and New Year's, with my, then girlfriend, now
mm,
wife, and my family. And the first week of January 2003,
mm.
I was onboarding for my new job.
Well, I love the emphasis on the writing skill because for me, that was what I showed up to NASA with was persuasion and writing skills, and I basically figured out the engineering side um, first to the point of being able to write effectively, and then beyond for my own idea exploration stuff like that. And I couldn't have known, but that's sort of been the through line of my career is that writing, which is not always there on the engineering community, and even when it is, um, engineers are busy engineering all day, and often when it comes to writing something for a proposal, it's extra work, and even if they are good at it, they don't want to do it, and they really shouldn't. They ideally their time would be spent on engineering, and that was such a big everywhere I've been. That was such a big issue that it's created opportunities for me, um, and led me to a very rewarding and interesting career, helping basically helping technical people communicate to the stakeholders, sponsors, users, um, Congress in some cases, and so I couldn't be happier with how that turned out, and it's very interesting to see that that's what the CIA wanted more almost than the engineering was the communication skills, and coincidentally, our previous guest was also had CIA experience on the laser side, uh, so so that's a pretty interesting streak here.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's
yeah,
because they recruited me, into the Directorate of Intelligence,
mm,
and so they recruited me, specifically, to be an analyst, as
mm,
opposed to going in, to the Director of Science and Technology, which
mm,
would have been more of that, more traditional,
sure,
engineering development and project management. This was, really about, looking at complex technical issues
mm,
and then boil it down into the what and the so what. How can you
sure,
take 6 to 9 months to years of technical intelligence gathering and analysis and
mm,
boil that down into 2 paragraphs for a policymaker? And
wow,
that I realize now, I didn't fully appreciate it at the time because I was just immersed in it,
uh,
but learning how to write for policymakers and how to articulate a value proposition and
mm,
how you can act on that value
mm,
proposition, that was absolutely foundational for me in my career.
sure.
And I would trade that experience for anything.
You know, I had a similar. That reminds me of a conclusion I've come to about part of my own career, which was working for the National Space Power Office. And hello to our co-host Wednesday the cat. She's late. Usually she's up here right away. Yes. Hi. Um,
I wouldn't be surprised if one of my 3 cats
oh,
joins us as well.
perfect. Yeah. Yeah. Um, and one of my first jobs at JPL, once I got out of the export compliance office, was advising Congress, writing documents that would go to Congress about the plutonium 238 availability for deep space missions. And I didn't know it at the time, but that was exposure, as you can imagine, to all kinds of interesting subjects, even
Mhm.
on the purely civil side of nuclear power or radioisotope power generation. Yeah, so I think that that was similarly meaningful to me. So curious then how you came to well, I never know quite what to ask when someone brings up the CIA, which has happened twice this week, which is fun. But what can or would you be comfortable sharing about that, and how that led to the next step for
Yeah.
you? Actually, I remember my question. I do want to get to that, but my question was actually when you had that offer and you realized it wasn't as a more traditional engineering role, did you think? How did you feel about how that might affect your your options going forward? Because I know a lot of people might see, oh, this isn't engineering work. That's not what I signed up for. So how did you think about
Yeah.
that? Or
No, it honestly, it immediately appealed to me.
hmm,
I was a student class officer in the AIAA section, that we
hmm,
had at Texas A&M, and one year we had a senior systems architect from Boeing Space Exploration,
hmm,
come give us a talk. And I'll never forget, the way he opened it. He said, there are two kinds of engineers: those who like to count and those who don't like to count. And it's
uh,
not to say that any of us are bad at math. Some of us just really love our math. And
yeah,
some of us see it as a means to an end. And he said, the engineers who like to count, they become subject matter experts. They dig deep in their field. They know the equations in their sleep, and
hmm,
we need them and we love them. That's how we solve hard problems. But then those of us that think of math as a tool, we tend to become systems engineers. We like to look at the big picture.
hmm,
How do all the pieces fit together? And how do you take, those hard technical problems and turn that into something that either, accomplishes a mission or satisfies a business case? And just the
hmm,
way that that gentleman was talking, it immediately resonated me. And kind of like, that, moment when I was 7 and I realized I wanted to be an aerospace engineer, when he was giving that talk, I was like, oh, like I want to go into systems
ah,
engineering.
okay,
And so when, I, kind of received that, that pitch in the interview, like, yeah, get your clearance, come do systems engineering with
sure,
us, learn how to talk to policymakers. I was like, yes,
perfect,
that's what I
yeah.
want to do.
Well, sounds like a product market fit. First try. Yeah, I the math is not my strong suit, but it's been interesting over the years. I've kind of developed my own relationship with that uh, as I've tried to understand what it represents for the purposes of communicating it.
Hmm.
And it's been very interesting to come back at the math that way because my math was never going to be good enough to start my career in a math heavy role. But I can read it to the point where I can understand things like the scaling, the relationships between systems, and so on. And you sort of start to have an intuition about it. At the same time, I've known people who have what seems to me to be a superhuman ability to think in terms of the math. It's really been quite an amazing thing to see different people uh, applying those ideas sometimes as naturally as I would speak, say a sentence. So I don't think that was so my conclusion that that was not how I would make a contribution was the right one. There are plenty of people out there far more naturally mathematical, I would say, than me. So but it sounds like for you that you really had the right opportunity at the right time, and it was a no brainer. Okay, so back to the other question of, where did that take you and what was next?
Yeah. I could have stayed there, if I really wanted to. I had a lot of great opportunities in front of me. But there were two things. One, my wife was pursuing her career in medicine, and we did long distance the entire time that I was in the
Mm,
DC area, and that sucked. And I knew, this was the person that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. And I spent a year, on rotation in the ops center while I
mm.
was there, and I was fortunate enough, in some ways, to be on duty when Burt Rutan, won the X Prize.
Ah,
And because we didn't have a crisis going on at the time, they actually let me put it up on the big screen,
Uh,
and we're watching Spaceship One
yeah.
scream across the sky.
This is 2004.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my senior duty officer, who was, a wonderful mentor to me, he and I still, stay in touch now, 20 years later. Uh, he leaned over and he's like, Justin, what are you doing here? I was like, oh, I promise her, I'm not letting this distract me on top of
Yeah.
all my
Yeah.
tasks. He's like,
Yeah.
no, 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 no. He's like, I'm not worried about that. He's like, why are you here? That's where you belong. And it kind of like had that moment again, another one of those moments where it was like, yeah, like I am grateful to be here. I love being part of an organization that is, very, mission driven.
Mm.
Like once you're in that community, as long as you stay focused on the mission and doing the best you can, like it, very much is a family, and it's very similar to NASA in
Mm.
that way.
Uh,
And that was one of the other things that, appealed to me about being there. But he was right. Like, space is my first love,
yeah.
and I really realized in that moment that I needed to figure out a way to get
Sure.
back to that, and not just kind of coast doing what I was doing and wait for something to pop up. That
Yeah.
I needed to make something happen.
Well, I love that that's the example you bring up, because that moment also meant something to me. I didn't know it at the time, and it's also a really interesting kind of milestone looking backwards at some of the major changes in the marketplace and the industry that we're heavily involved in now. I was on a plane when that happened, and I saw it on the little tiny plane screen. And I had been kind of paying attention to it. I certainly didn't have any context for the government versus private, all of that stuff. I had didn't know how NASA worked or anything. Um, but it felt like a really big deal, right? Like it and it, in that era when the space shuttle was struggling, and the future of it wasn't quite clear. Not that it's clear now, 21 years later, but it felt like a really important thing. And I love that I saw it on a little tiny plane screen full of static, because I don't know, it's just a fun contrast. And that there's something snapped in my head then too, and I just knew this was going to be a lot of opportunity, and I don't even think I could have phrased it that way. Now I would use startup business terms, greenfield, blue sky, jargon. Um, but at the time, it just felt like, wow, this is new. This is really cool. And it's not like I didn't already want to work for NASA, but it felt like NASA plus, and so I imagine a lot of people our age, roughly our age range, probably had a similar awakening moment almost, and then every year after that, I thought, okay, when's it going to start flying daily, and of course the engineering realities have delayed that somewhat, to put it lightly. Although maybe now we're getting closer with the Blue Origin flight. So okay, so if I understand correctly, you went from that to Redwire to Intuitive Machines, right? Or am I missing a step?
There are a couple of steps in
Okay.
between. Again, at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of hiring going on in civil space.
Mm,
So Rice University invited me
mm,
to come do grad school there on a fellowship.
wow.
And that worked great because, it got me back to Houston,
Mm,
where my wife was attending medical school, kind of back on my home turf.
sure.
And, it was a really great, opportunity that, as long as I was, hosting office hours for the undergrads and,
Sure.
doing help sessions for them, Rice paid for everything. Uh,
Sure. Sure.
and that was, too great of an opportunity to look up. And I knew that, kind of having that combo of, Texas A&M undergrad, top 10
Mm,
aerospace, college with, a master's degree from Rice. I knew that was going to open doors for me,
sure.
once I got to that
Well,
endpoint.
plus CIA on your resume.
Right, right.
Um,
Plus my experience.
one of the things I want to I want viewers of this podcast to see is the different paths that people take. So I'm curious if you could go into a little more detail. How did that invitation come? Did you apply? Did you know someone? You know, because a lot of people like myself at that age looked to people who were doing big things. It's like, how do you get there? You know, what do I do today and tomorrow and the next day to set myself up? So how
Yeah.
did that
So
happen for you?
yeah, now once I realized that again, there wasn't a whole lot of hiring going on, and frankly, I felt like the clock was ticking.
Mm-hmm.
I either needed to make something happen, or uh, it might be the end of that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I was like, okay, let's see, if grad school, is an option. And I put in it, you know, took the GRE,
Mm-hmm.
put in applications, and interestingly enough, all my top three choices, got back with me. I applied at
Mm-hmm.
Texas A&M, Rice, and the University of Houston,
Mm-hmm.
and my offer from Texas A&M was actually from my propulsion professor. And when I talked to Dr. Seismus, I was like, that wasn't my best class. So I'm actually like really curious, why you want to make me an offer. And he's like, well, you always worked hard, and you always helped your fellow students around you, and you were always honest with me, and you did well, in all of your other classes. And, that's the kind of, person that I'm looking for in my
Mm-hmm.
lab. And I was like, oh, thank you. That's amazing. He's like, so have you applied anywhere else? And I told him,
Mm-hmm.
and he was not, hands on. He was like, I will hold this spot for you as long as I can. But if you get an offer from Rice, take it. Don't even think about
Wow.
coming back to College Station. If you get
Uh-huh.
into Rice, take it. So he was like, call me as soon as you know. And like a week later, I got the offer letter, from Rice. And so I called him back and let him know. And he was like, go with my blessing.
Sure.
And I can find someone else to fill this slot
Sure.
now, but it's like you've got this.
Well, what a wonderful, that's the kind of mentor you want for everyone, right? I mean, so yeah, just 100% committed, even if it's not with them, committed to your success. And I can certainly relate to the two body problem of medical training and, professional opportunities. Okay, so this was what, getting into the 05-06 time frame. Um, I'm curious at what point, and so that was what, the Constellation days of
Yeah, I was at
NASA,
Rice from 2005 to 2007.
Okay. And Constellation, for the listeners, being the post shuttle architecture concept for continued human spaceflight to the moon and maybe to Mars, largely using, well, using as much of previously developed and engineered stuff as possible. Um, that could be its own 10-hour
Yeah.
podcast, but the basically one of the George W. Bush parting gift to NASA, sort of. Uh,
Oh,
um,
that's actually how I got back in.
oh,
I
okay.
was, finishing up my master's degree,
Uh-huh.
and one of my, committee members, and great mentorship and advice, throughout my career. One of my committee members was like, hey, like if you aren't 115% committed to the PhD track,
Mm,
it is not worth it. It will crush
mm,
you. And he's like, so, what's your plan? I was like, well, I don't have a plan. He's like, what do you mean you don't have a plan? And it's like, well, my advisor, wonderful human being, great scientist, but he's also, the deputy chair of the department. And so there just wasn't, time, and there wasn't, really a plan. And I was still, junior enough in my career that, I was worried about, saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong
yeah.
thing. And I was, looking, for direction. And he was just like, you know, he was like, you knocked it out of the park in your defense, but your draft was too short because you're still, writing,
Hmm.
for value propositions, not for academia. And I was like, I need to go back to work. And he's like, yeah, I think you should go back to work. I think you'll be more fulfilled. And, and your advisor's probably going to kill me, but, you know, I think that's the right path for you.
Okay.
And so as I was wrapping up my master's, there was a ton of hiring, going on for
Mm.
Constellation. And
Ah.
so I ended up going into the modeling and simulation group at L3 Titan. We were embedded on site at JSC, helping build up the Constellation training facility.
Mm. I see. Yeah, that Constellation, the Constellation program, I didn't know about it really until I started at JPL in 2010. But one I had a very memorable experience where there was a rover concept that had legs and wheels. It was called
Yep,
Athlete,
athlete.
all-terrain hex-legged extraterrestrial explorer. Shout out to Matt Frost, who hopefully hears this. And basically, I was in my export control office, and I look out, or I go outside, and this spider robot is slowly plodding along the street. And I'm new at JPL at the time, and I'm mostly doing paperwork type, reviews and looking up lists of technologies and things like that. And this spider robot walks by, and I'm like, this is where I belong. This is the right place for me. And I followed the spider robot as one does, and I met Matt and some other people, and um, I started to learn how it was part of this larger, architectural concept. And then I started to learn, well, how does something like this end up here at JPL? How's it paid for? How does it fit into the bigger plan? And I eventually started to look upwards at the program structures and NASA itself. And there was a program manager at JPL who had just come back from headquarters for 2 years. And at the time, I remember wanting to spend as much time with him as I could because I was realizing that, well, that without that, we don't have anything to build here. And, unfortunately, JPL is facing that situation now. But as part of my overall goal of I wanted to understand how things work, it just kept me going up and up and up. And of course, my wife's medical career took us to DC, which I was very unhappy about at first, but which gave me a lot of opportunity to really see that firsthand, um, which I'm very grateful for. So, okay, so you got back into Constellation. Um, Now, I think around that time, 8, 9, 10, we were still waiting for the next flight of Spaceship One, or we were still kind of wondering, okay, oh, and New Mexico was building that spaceport, which I remember also felt like a big deal. I didn't quite know at that time how the world of real estate development works to the point where you can get cities and states to pay for building stuff, whether or not there's a customer. Um, but that was exciting. It felt like a opening of a new era. I don't know what they're doing with that facility now, but I think that perhaps the commercial tourism was oversold, or
Yeah.
maybe that's just how real estate always is. Anyways, okay. So next, when did you leave? When did you leave government service again, so to speak?
Yeah. So I only, it was interesting, working as an embedded contractor,
Hmm.
uh, because, essentially, as long as you're keeping your NASA customer happy, the company, largely stays out of your way.
Hmm.
And so that was a really interesting experience for me. But, from my time, in the intelligence community, they taught us how to evaluate programs and look at, both their technical and their program health, because we want to know, are our adversaries throwing good money after bad, or are they
Hmm.
on track, to deploy something that can be a real threat? Uh, and so
Interesting.
bringing that experience, back in, I very quickly, realized that we were not on a good footing. We were running simulations for flights
Interesting.
that were never going to happen. They were
Yeah.
cutting our scope. We were in this weird place where they were like, "Oh, you can only, build sims for the mission of flying, Orion to the space station." But
Hmm.
they're up on the hill saying, "Oh, we need to put station in the ocean so we can rate its budget,
Yeah.
to build the next phase." And I was like,
Right.
"This doesn't make any sense."
Yeah.
And right about that time, Congress sent the Army, completely back to the drawing board on the Future Combat Systems program, which was, an order of magnitude bigger than Constellation. And they got told, you screwed this up so bad that, you have to start all over again, complete termination, go back to the drawing board, do it over again. And, in an environment like that, I was like, there is no way that Constellation is coming out of this unscathed. Uh,
Interesting.
so and there were some weird kind of internal dynamics, going on the team that I was on. It, I didn't feel like I was going to be able to, continue making progress where
Sure.
I was. So again, I, started casting my net, leveraging my network,
Yeah.
did a couple of interviews, and things didn't quite pan out. But then, around that time, the then center director had, organized these, campaigns of what he called, inclusion and innovation. He
Mm,
was trying to prepare the JSC community for a time, when
mm,
they weren't riding high on the hog like they were on Constellation, and to
interesting.
get them to think about how to
Yeah.
build a more innovation driven environment, how to be
Uh,
more inclusive in how we build and run teams. And I had been, and they did this really interesting thing where, each of the working groups, they paired a young professional with a more senior,
oh,
NASA
okay.
executive. So I was co-chair of the barriers working group with Sharon Thomas,
Mm,
who's a senior NASA executive at JSC. And we had, amazing mentors in Marilyn Ditmar and Mark Craig. And on that
mm,
team, we had, astronaut Andy Thomas, other young professionals like Heather Hava, and, people from around the center. And it was our job to look at like, what are the system level barriers
mm.
to inclusion and innovation?
Uh, Before you go on, when you say inclusion, are you using that word the way we mean it now, or did it mean something different in 08, 09? I feel like that might have been referring to other technologies.
No, it was about how we make sure that we, don't let systemic, unconscious
Really?
biases keep us from,
Wow.
bringing in
That's
creative thinkers.
that's like beyond ahead of the curve.
Yeah,
Wow. Okay.
yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that was so long ago. I thought for sure you must be meaning it differently, but that's really interesting. So, so one thing I've always wondered, worked at, not having been employed long term at a center like JC, is when it's clear politically that the goal is to do as little new engineering as possible by reusing shuttle and even Saturn V stuff. Is there a kind of dissonance at the ground level where you're like, this is never actually going to work? Or it's clear how did you ever face that? I mean, when I was that age, I probably would have been too naive to think that way. And I hate to almost, almost prefer being naive because the reality of things can sometimes be pretty disheartening. But I wonder if you could speak to that, as you were doing simulations, like you said, for things that would never happen. Period.
Well, and we were doing simulations, for things where, we were getting, the Antares flight code,
Mm,
from Langley, and, building that, into our sims. And like, I know there's still some people that, think that, Ares One was the best thing, that the agency could have ever done.
mm,
But based on what I saw, I never would have flown on that vehicle. I wouldn't have signed myself up for that. And so, that was one of those things where I was good enough at the math,
mm.
to be able to look at that and say, nope,
Yeah.
that's never actually going to happen. And so, that actually kind of drove, that next transition.
Mm,
An opportunity opened up in the space station payloads office, and I decided that, wanted to work on something that was actually flying.
yeah.
Again, I put in my application. I was, pretty junior, in terms of
Mm,
applying for the role. But because, Mark Craig, as our, Tiger Team mentor, had gotten to know me and knew what I was capable of, he was able to say, to the company, like, he's younger than all of the other, candidates that have applied,
mm,
but he has the pulse of what the customer wants,
mm,
and he's known to them. And it is an investment in the future of what's coming, and it gives us the ability to stay on the forefront if we go
Yeah,
with him. And so he essentially, was able to open the door for me to get the interview. And
sure.
then went in and did the interview. And after the interview, the hiring manager was like, "Okay, now I understand." And I got the job.
Well, it's interesting as we go through this whole journey, you've used the word customer for the first time, and I feel like capital C customer here, as the station for listeners who might not know, has has equipment on it, systems on it that are both from NASA and academia, but also commercial companies and partnerships in between. It was really a pre Obama era COTS program almost, commercial off the shelf of trying to broaden the aperture of getting things into space than just large government contracts. So I can see the theme here, the theme developing. At what point did you realize internally that oh, this is where the action is next?
But yeah,
Um,
um,
and I also I should have asked this question after the following thought, but when there's a giant space station orbiting the Earth, I can imagine the light bulb moment you had. We're like, wait a minute, this thing is already up there. They're not going to let it come down easily.
yep,
That's where I got to be.
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very much that. Really almost immediately, when I joined the team, and
Mm,
got onboarded, got trained, put to work in the payloads office, and it was kind of like, oh yeah, like this is where we need to be.
mm.
And that was around the time that Congress really started getting serious about utilizing the space station as a national laboratory.
Ah, okay.
So really, right place, right time. uh, you know, NASA stood up the ISS National Lab office, at Johnson Space Center, to try to figure out, exactly what to do about this. They put Mary Beth Dean in charge of
Mm,
it. She was one of, Mike Sefferdini's, management proteges,
mm,
and she had, spearheaded, the deal between NASA and Hamilton Sundstrand to do Sabatier water processing as a service on
okay.
station, and so that's why they picked her to kind of lead this new initiative. And so they looked at me and they're like, okay, he's the only person in the office under the age of 30. He doesn't know what can't be done, and there
Yeah,
is no rule book for what we're
sure.
doing here.
Sure.
So Justin, you report to Mary Beth now. Go figure it out.
I love that, and especially the comment about not knowing what can't be done. Um, I was pretty shy when I got to JPL because I did not have the traditional technical background, but I quickly realized I was going to have to ask stupid questions. Now I enjoy it greatly because I've had enough decent ideas amongst 10 times as many terrible ones, but I've had enough decent ones. I know once in a while a stupid question is worth asking. And I was in this meeting about the Sophia astrophysics aircraft thing.
Hmm.
And imagine for everyone listening, you take out a big airplane and you cut a hole in the side and you put a telescope through it. And then you fly it at night as high as you can and look up at the sky. And so you get your telescope above much of the atmosphere, not all of it. And so the question was, well, it's costing them a lot of money, and how do we use it better, and what other applications could it have? I believe it was ultimately canceled much later, but my stupid question was, hey, can we fly it upside down and look down at the ground? And because I believe it was an infrared telescope that you could potentially use
Hmm.
to look for signs of different kinds of activity on the ground, underground, in different environments, and I didn't know that wasn't possible. And in the end, they basically said, they'd allow the plane to fly at 90 degrees, but not totally upside down. Okay, fair enough. So I just love that story, and it I appreciate hearing from others the value of not knowing what's impossible, um, especially in this new world that has so many different actors, and I would argue has NASA taking a step back, um, leadership wise. That's about as generous as I can put it. in some technology areas. So I want to respect your hard stop in about 15 minutes. So can you take us through getting to where you are now, and how you see what you're doing now kind of going forward into the future with uncertain global space leadership, as I think is a fair assessment.
Yeah. So, that experience, really convinced me that, the future of space is the industrialization of our solar system, that we need to figure out how to put the resources of the solar system to work to improve human society. And it's not flags and footprints, and it's not just science for science's sake. It's how do we create that flywheel so that
Hmm.
everybody on the earth can enjoy a good standard of living without causing major ecological devastation
Yeah.
that has resulted from the industrial era on Earth. And the only way we can do that without polluting the oceans, tearing down the
Mm.
rainforests, or subjecting people to inhumane conditions is to go to space. Uh,
Mm.
and and so that kind of long-term view was something that I developed, while I was working, on the ISS National Lab, and then helping CASIS,
Mm.
the Center for the
Okay.
Advancement of Science and Space, stand up their independent management of the ISS National Lab. So, working down that path, trying to facilitate other people to be successful. That's actually how I met Intuitive Machines for the first time.
Okay.
Uh, Around in that kind of 2015 time frame, Andrew Rush cornered me at the ISPCS conference in New Mexico, and just like, hey, like, you can do more on the industry side than you can working for a
Yeah.
nonprofit, and I want you to come help me grow this company called Made in Space, because you've got the same vision that I do, and we're gonna take this thing and run with it, and I want you to be part of that team. And so we lucked out that at the same time that he wanted to hire me, Mayo Clinic here in Florida was also hiring for my
Oh,
wife's area of expertise.
wow.
And Andrew is a Jacksonville, Florida native, so when it came time to grow the company, he planted
Mm.
the flag here. So we came out here 9 years ago, and I helped Andrew grow the company from 22 people when I joined to over
Uh,
170, all the way up
I
through
just
our,
want
our
to
Redwire
pause.
acquisition.
Okay, I want to pause to acknowledge the superhuman feat of a medical and non-medical couple simultaneous
Yes.
job job move. Um, that's fantastic. I mean, yet another thing we could do another hour just on the medical professional partner thing. Um, but that's an amazing achievement, and I didn't know that. So super cool. It is possible to
It
anyone
is
listening.
possible.
it is possible. Great stuff. Sorry, go on. You were
Yeah.
talking about the Redwire acquisition.
Yeah. And, so, we, and then, after we got acquired by Redwire, I spent about 2 years, helping on, corporate development, trying to help come up with, an integrated, business development plan for civil and commercial space. Um, but, as you're, probably well aware, the SPAC mergers, did not work out as well, for everybody,
Mm.
as was intended. And, NASA and other government agencies were not yet prepared to move, in space manufacturing into operational missions.
Mm.
And so we were kind of in this weird place where technologically we were ahead of where, the government and commercial markets, really
Mm.
were. Given the, financial situation, that wasn't something that, Redwire, was really willing to float to keep
Okay.
alive until the customers were ready. So, rather than drag that out, I agreed to leave. I agreed to leave.
Ah. Okay.
And that was actually the first time, that I had, left without having, a, already detailed plan of what I was going to do and where I was going to go next.
Sure.
And so I took that time, while I was on my severance package, to really,
Mm,
sit down and think about what was important to me and where I wanted to go next, how I wanted to have an impact,
sure.
reconnect with my family, and figure out, what I was going to do next. And, I had the good fortune again, I interviewed a couple of places, nothing felt quite right. And then Steve Altimus called me
Mm,
and it's like, hey, can I fly you down to Houston? I was like, well, I'm not doing anything else right now.
yeah.
Uh, and it didn't even feel like an interview. It was just, this wonderful conversation about, the company that Steve was trying to build and where he wanted to go with it and how he thought I could help.
Mm,
And then he just said, hey, can you come do for Intuitive Machines what you did for Made in Space? And we shook hands and that was it.
okay. So, so tell us about what, I mean, you had the recent lunar mission. Tell us about the kind of recent and the recent events in the pipeline for intuitive machines and what that means to you personally, and how you see that fitting into the unpredictable world that we have now when it comes to global space events.
Yeah. Well, if you look at, companies, the tech companies, that are most successful today, what they've done is build platforms where lots of
Mm,
different people can do lots of different kinds of work and
mm,
be successful because they're not having to reinvent the wheel and build that infrastructure for themselves. And like
yes.
Amazon makes more money off of AWS than just
Right.
about anything else.
Right.
Uh,
Well, and just to interject
yeah,
there, yeah, I worked for AWS for 3 years,
yeah,
and I saw this flywheel concept that you referred to as a core part of the business. How do you make business grow business? And I thought that the flywheel was a really effective way to communicate that. And I'll
right.
put some stuff in the show notes about that if anyone's curious. But please
Yeah.
continue.
And so, for us, IM was originally founded, by, Steve, Tim Crane, who's my boss, and Cam Gafarian to be this, think tank to,
Mm,
to take, the NASA way of problem solving and apply that to other industries. But then when the Commercial Lunar Payload Services program came
mm,
along, they were just like, hey, like we know how to do this. We did the Morpheus, program at JSC, like we can really do this. And so, they went all in, on this CLIPS program opportunity and, use that as, the launch pad for everything else that like, if you can land, robotic autonomous lander at the South Pole, with, high degree of, precision and accuracy, you solve that problem, that opens up a whole lot of other
yeah.
capabilities.
Ah,
And you see that in what we're doing. We're the sole provider for lunar data and navigation relay around the moon for NASA. We're actually launching the first satellite in that kind of mini constellation next year. We're
okay.
one of the three finalists to build the next the lunar terrain vehicle
Hmm.
for NASA, and it's all based around this idea that if we use commercial oriented development practices and we do firm fixed price contracts to deliver services
Mm,
to our government customers rather than the government being the owner operator and developer, which is what
right.
dries up cost and schedule. We can provide these platforms where maybe NASA's the anchor customer, but when NASA's not using it, we can do work for others and help
Yeah.
grow the markets that way. So it's like, yes, we're a lunar lander company, but we're also, a surface mobility company. We're
Sure.
also, a lunar comms company. We're the only company that has, a global ground station network, capable of, reaching out to lunar distances. And
Ah,
all
okay.
of that infrastructure together creates this platform to do meaningful work in space that brings
Yeah.
value back to life here on Earth.
So it's sort of a if you build it on the moon, they will come.
Yeah,
Or they're already
yeah,
there waiting for you to
right,
build it on the moon.
right.
Yeah,
It's this idea
yeah.
that like, we have national strategic interests in going back to the moon and building
Hmm.
up sustainable activity. And by, addressing, those kind of, first mover strategic needs for the country, but also having excess capacity to go along with that, that lowers the barrier to entry
Yeah,
for, other, non-governmental, uses of
right.
space.
Well, I think it will be very interesting in the future to see what people write about the era between 1972 and right about now. As we got to the moon without a long-term plan, or at least I believe that the people at NASA thought there was a long-term plan, but then Nixon, you know, gutted it. But
Well,
um,
and Apollo was always a geopolitical battle
right,
first and
yeah,
foremost. The
yeah,
objective was not to build, a sustainable long-term, lunar exploration
right,
development program. The objective was to beat the Soviet Union to the
yeah,
moon. And once that geopolitical objective of demonstrating, American superiority
hmm
through, this extreme, technological, program was accomplished, the political support evaporated.
yeah, yeah, and I think of it as once the geopolitical incentive or urgency was gone, NASA suddenly became comparable to Department of Education or all kinds of other daily functioning of society things that a long-term expensive space program could not was very difficult to compare to, to say nothing of Vietnam War and other things going on at the time. Yeah, you and I happen to be born during that gap when hopefully we've there's a better model now, or at least more sustainable model. I mean, I still get a lot of people asking me, why should we go to space at all? And my answer is always, well, how much time have you got? I could make that case. Kind of bringing us back to the beginning, or close to the beginning of our conversation about, well, all this money is spent here, you know, it and I guess the flywheel is really the best way to think about it, is in the same way that expanding to the New World helped Spain with some hiccups. The that same kind of economic and industrial flywheel can apply out in space. You just have to bring your own air. Um,
Well,
and
and,
so
and
yeah,
and that's what I think, the great thing, about, space-based economic development is, like, we don't have to use the colonial model.
mm,
We know,
yes,
the harm that
mm,
caused. There are, entire countries that are still suffering today,
yeah,
because of the impacts of those decisions that were literally made hundreds of years ago.
right,
These people have never been allowed, to, really catch up and enjoy, the, technological and, economic growth, that, we've experienced over the past 100 years, because of their status as colonial states. And so, there is, no, other, people to conquer out in space.
yeah,
There is no worry about, causing widespread ecological devastation, damaging, sensitive habitats to get at valuable resources. It Yes, it's expensive to get there and expensive to get back from a transportation perspective, but from an abundance perspective, there are, more, useful materials on a single asteroid than has ever been mined in all of the history of humanity combined. In fact, the most productive mining sites, here on the Earth are ancient impact craters, because the native sources of those materials that formed along with the Earth were all so heavy they sunk down to the core
yeah,
eons ago. And
huh,
so the goal of, developing the moon as an industrial park, the goal of companies that are trying to do, asteroid resources, is to actually go to where these, critical minerals are naturally abundant, and
hmm,
then, economically, bring those back and pull them into our economic sphere. And
yeah,
that way you can actually increase the size of the pie for everybody, and it's not, just dependent on, these old, models
yeah. Well,
of development.
it's increasing the pie without increasing the human suffering. And I really love that I really love that approach, that thought about it. I had never put it together in that way, but I'm definitely going to repeat that in future conversations. I really like that. It's sort of like conquering, instead of conquering people, it's we're conquering our own human nature
Yeah. Like,
of
I was
short-sightedness, bickering, and all those other things to get the technology out there. Um, so
I was
I
like,
think yeah.
yeah, I was a competitive swimmer growing up,
Okay.
and I loved competitive swimming because, yes, we were organized as a team, and
Uh,
yes, there's a lot of camaraderie around that. We did the relay races,
mm,
but it was ultimately about, how far can you push yourself?
mm,
And, you're not, taking away from someone else to be
yeah.
successful, to win. It's all
Sure.
about, how do you conquer that
Right.
environment that's in front of you to
Yeah.
be, the best version of yourself that you can be.
Yeah.
And I think that's what space offers us, as a civilization and
Mm,
as a people is, that is the ultimate challenge. That is the ultimate access, to the universe, which, I've very much, subscribe, to the Carl Sagan view that, we are the universe experiencing
mm,
itself. And so, yes, we can do that, for, expanding the human condition through exploration. And yes, there's a basic science, fundamental science aspect to it that's important. But this, kind of third path of, economic development is something that I think the time is right, to take that more seriously. And frankly, our adversaries are, uh, and, there's no better time, than the present, I think, to do that.
yeah. Well, I think that's a really great place to end it today. I'm gonna I'm gonna think more about that sort of philosophical approach. I look forward to talking to you more about that. Uh, and I wish you the best of luck, and of course, intuitive machines. Wow, I got to think about how to integrate that into kind of my own thinking. So thank you so much for that perspective.
Absolutely.
So with that, thanks to everyone listening. This is Space Madness Podcast, Episode 3. Talk to you next time.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.